live already. We are live. It is 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern, and it's time for Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. We've been kind of building up to this. I've got this bad habit where I like to go on the group and make sure that we're actually live. And so I'm going to just do that real quickly, Jim. I like to go on the site and make sure that I can see us, and I can see us. We are most definitely live. So I'm going to give it a couple of minutes for people to join. And once they do, I'm going to start talking about a little bit of housekeeping stuff, and then we'll jump into our show.
Sure.
For those of you who are just joining us, feel free to add some chat comments so I can see that you're listening and that we're coming through. Particularly if we like to know that we're coming through clearly and that the show looks good. So feel free to share your comments throughout the broadcast. I can see them live on the right-hand side of the screen. For those of you who don't know, the gentleman on the right on the screen is Jim Kennard. Jim Kennard's an old friend of mine, but more importantly, Jim is probably, I think, one of the most prolific shipwreck hunters on the Great Lakes, and certainly a pioneer in side scan technology, and really somebody who's, found the second most historic shipwreck that ever happened on the Great Lakes, and certainly the oldest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, the HMS Ontario. So very excited to have Jim Kennard with us on the show tonight. Welcome, Jim.
Good to be here, Brendan.
Still waiting for people to join. I am starting to see some chat. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I see we've got a couple of people on the channel. Well, why don't we dive in? I've got a couple of things that I need to take care of in terms of housekeeping. So I just want to thank everybody who has been tuning in and watching this show I think we're on our, I think this is our fourth show, and I've been having them every week. And I've got a lot of people queued up, a lot of really good, people who are doing exciting things on the Great Lakes. And that's kind of what I like to do, is reach out there and find people who, have done amazing things with Great Lakes Shipwrecks or are really being innovative and doing really neat things with Great Lakes Shipwrecks. And educate our audience about all the cool stuff that's out there. The group is growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, most of you know that I kind of started this for me and 50 of my geeky shipwreck buddies, and it pretty quickly took off into, I think we're up to 1,300 members now, and that's just in a couple of months. We've been getting like 100 members every 3-4 days. So welcome to everybody. We're really glad to have you. Thank you for participating in our community. Feel free to share your posts of new and interesting Great Lakes shipwreck and maritime history things on our site. For those of you who haven't seen, I just released two new videos. One of them is titled "Shipwrecks from Outer Space." A lot of people enjoyed it. It talks about how to use Google Earth now that we've seen the water clear up from the quagga mussels, and we see a lot more shipwrecks from satellite imagery. And so I did a pretty good tutorial where I fly you around using Google Earth and show you all the secret hidden features for finding shipwrecks. So that was kind of fun. And then Jim knows my talk, famous wrecks that never happened, about legendary ships like the Le Jean Florin and the Blanc Henri and the Kitty Reeves and the various other things that were introduced into the record by the treasure hunting genre of the 60s. So feel free to check those out. And then lastly, before we dive in with Jim, we've got a bunch of new people scheduled to come on the show. Next week is Tom Crossman, a really, really interesting guy who does some fascinating stuff with remote sensing. He's kind of one of the most innovative people for finding lost things on the Great Lakes right now. After that, we have Terrace Lysenko. Many of you asked for him. He has spent 30 years of his life searching the Lake Michigan Southern Basin, locating lost warbirds and raising them for military museums. Really interesting fellow. The T in A&T recovery, they found many, many shipwrecks on Lake Michigan. So interesting guy. Week after that, the author Wes Olszewski. Many of you have Wes's books. Wes and I go way back. He's a great guy, and we're going to have a really exciting conversation. After Wes is Fred Stonehouse. We're having our Avery Color Studios month where we get all their authors on. And Fred and I also will have an excellent conversation. And we'll top that off with Kathy Green, who is the director of the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. And we're going to talk about the Wisconsin Maritime Museum's emphasis now that they've had for quite a while now on Great Lakes shipwrecks and what's going on there. So going to be a real exciting month. Watch these now, because in the summer I'm rolling back to one a month. I'm not doing a show every week throughout the summer, because why? We're all going to be out on the lake, right?
Absolutely.
I hope so. All right. So I think I gave Jim a little bit of an introduction there, but I first met Jim, oh God, I can remember. It must be 15 years ago now.
Probably on one of your forums, I think.
Yeah, I think it was on the old Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group forum.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And then I came to Cleveland to give a talk on the Griffin. And I'll never forget that night at Great Lakes Historical Society. There was an awards banquet, and they kept giving, every award giver gave a speech and another speech, and it kept running long. I was supposed to go in at 8. I didn't get on until 9 o'clock. And the whole time there was free wine at the table. And by the time I got up there to give my talk, I was drunker than a skunk. Almost slurring my speech. So I apologize to anybody who had to sit through that. But Jim and I got interested in going to look for the Griffin together, didn't we?
We did. Yeah, absolutely.
And Jim brought his deep vision side scan, and we went up to Sochua Point. And I won't go into all the research, but one of the fun things that we found was that. Jim, how long was the fish in the water before we ran that over?
I don't think it was in the water more than 15 or 20 minutes. We had a general idea where it was, or you did anyway, and put the fish in. And I think the first thing we got was kind of really fuzzy, and then we turned the boat around, and I think we got a much better picture.
That's the William Holm. I think we got her within 5 minutes. It was really something. We were talking shipwrecks, and Jim's like, we better see if we can find what it looks like. And all of a sudden, there it was, crawling across the screen. And Jim said, "Oh, there's a shipwreck." That was an
when my phone would ring, just at the time when we're on here.
It's all good.
By the way, I want to say, Brendan, that I applaud you for really putting on these shows for everybody, because I think this gives people that are interested in shipwrecks all around the Great Lakes a little chance to get to know some of the people that are doing things. And some of the times, the only time we really get a chance to talk to these people, or maybe at a show. And then at a show, it's so busy that maybe you're lucky to have a couple of minutes of conversation with them, and then you have to kind of move on. But and for us that are like on the east side of the Great Lakes, us to travel to the western part of the Great Lakes, sometimes it's a little too much. So this is a great way to kind of bridge the gap and bring people together and have a little time for us to understand some of our shipwreck peers that are out there. So congratulations for what you're doing. This is great stuff.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that coming from you. And it's a good chance to learn about people too, because I ask people to tell us about their backstory. So that's a good segue. For those, I'll take this image down. For those of you who are wondering whether we found the Griffin or not.
Yeah, we're not.
The only thing I can say is we got chewed alive by mosquitoes in the marina that night. Oh God. Anyway. Jim, the main thing, the thing I always start out with, one of the things people want to know is they want to know, kind of about the people who do this. They want to get to know them a little bit more on a personal level. Can you tell me, how the heck did you get into this? This is an unusual thing to get into. And I'd like to know what got you started and where your passion for this that's driven you to do this for so long and so well comes from.
Well, of course, you see a lot or maybe hearing a lot of stuff we're doing in Lake Ontario, but there's a whole backstory, probably 20 years before that. Actually, 50 years ago this month, I took a scuba diving course at the YMCA here in Rochester. That's what started everything. And you know, after the taking the course, you know, you do your general diving in any lake or body of water you can find around here, and for us, it's the Finger Lakes. So I spent a couple years down in the Finger Lakes, just scratching around in the mud down there, and you know, find an anchor, find a fishing pole. I mean, it's a great treasure, right? So, I mean, it was a whole new world. And, you know, this is back in 1970. So you have, there was a lot of influence by, we're hearing a lot about Jacques Cousteau and then Kip Wagner off of finding some of the 1715 fleet off of Florida, and later on Mel Fisher. So I grew up, you know, listening to and reading about these guys, and you know, that really encouraged me, you know, to do something up here. And finally, in 1970, there was a ship off of Pulteneyville called the St. Peter, and it was found by a friend of mine, and it still is the best, and there it is. It's still the best schooner to dive on off the southern shore of Lake Ontario in New York State. Three-masted schooner, sank in 1898, and so I was probably one of the first dozen divers to actually dive on that shipwreck. And of course, the visibility back then was, you know, when we had a 4 or 5 foot visibility, and say, oh, it's a great day. You know, today on the St. Peter, it's 110 feet of water. You can snorkel over the top of it, and you can see the whole thing when the sun is, you know, just directly above you. So. Yeah, and that's a picture, and I tell you, you see that mast? I banged into that mast, bottom of that mast, because the visibility was just so limited at the time. But it was exciting, you know, to dive on a shipwreck. There were no mussels back then. It was just a thin layer of silt that was on the rail or on the deck of the ship. You know, that's all gone today. But I got to see it, you know, when it didn't have all the mussels that looked like a coral reef. So that was the beginning. And I wanted to, after that, I dove on a couple other wrecks up in the St. Lawrence River. But I wanted to find actually, or dive on a shipwreck that nobody else had dove on. Because, you know, there was a mentality back in those days that divers were like a bunch of locusts. You know, they would dive on a shipwreck, and if there was anything loose, they would take it. And you know, I wanted to dive on a shipwreck that was virgin. Everything was there. And so so I learned about a special sonar called the side scan sonar. And when I found out how much it cost, it's like, oh my God, you know. Now, back then, the cost of these side scans were about $30,000, $35,000. That was over twice as much as what my first house cost. So there's no way I'm going to buy one. And I'm an electrical engineer. So a friend of mine had worked for a company that had actually built one of these. He kind of did a block diagram on what was involved, and make a long story short, via some surplus parts that I was able to get, and then I designed the electronics myself. And there's on the screen you can see the recorder, and it weighed 100 pounds, and but it worked. The paper that we used was kind of a damp paper, and it's actually a facsimile, really a facsimile machine. And that's what I used for 30 years, from 1970 forward, until later on I got the deep vision system. But so that was the start. And we made a decision not to. Well, let me back up a little bit. The first thing we did look for was this ship, the Ontario. You know, back then there were books that were written that talked about great treasures on some of these shipwrecks.
Sure,
And
sure.
the Ontario had a payroll on board, and one book said $500,000 and with gold and silver, and another book said 3 million. And you know, I'm thinking, wow, you know, I'm in my 20s, so I'm thinking, you know, find that ship, baby, and I'm retired. You know, so I built the side scan. We went out to I had a little bit of research, went out to the western part of Lake Ontario. We looked for it, but reality set in, and that is we didn't have any GPS back then. Even Loran C, which wasn't a bad positioning system. You could be, it was accurate within maybe 40 or 50 feet. And that was enough, but that didn't exist for us at that point in time. This is in the 70s. So the only thing you could do was to follow the contours of the lake, and that didn't work beyond a half a mile or so. And then we started to realize that, you know, that Ontario probably is in a 500 or 600 square mile area. It's probably way too deep, and we're recreational divers. So, you know, even if we did find it, we're not going to be able to, you know, we're not going to be able to dive on it. So we went other places. Now, what you just flashed up on the screen comes a little later. We started to, after that, we started to go to Lake Champlain. And we made a decision not to do anything in Lake Ontario because as we started to realize that most of those ships in Lake Ontario were way out in depths that we couldn't dive to. So we went to Lake Champlain, and we also went down in the New York Finger Lakes to look for canal boats down there. But Lake Champlain was just fantastic for us because we started to find things just about every weekend to find a new shipwreck. And I mean, a new shipwreck that nobody had been on before. Everything was there. And one day we're out in off of Burlington, Vermont, and we see this wreck. And I don't know. Yeah, you have I wonder if you've got the sides. No, I guess I didn't send you the side scan. Oh, yes. No, I didn't send you the side scan picture. But we found this boat. This is a horse-powered ferry boat. It's the only one that exists. We found a patent for it at 1819. This is a boat where the horses walked on a wheel that was below deck, and one walked forward and one walked in the other direction, and they pushed against this wheel, as you can see in the illustration here, and it through a gearing mechanism they drove the paddle wheels. This was prior to when the treadmill was developed. Treadmill came in about 1840, and horse-powered ferry boats went to a treadmill design after that. But where they were used commonly was in short distances, maybe a mile or two. They were common over in Europe. They were common on the Hudson River, and also I think on the Mohawk River in New York State, and also in parts of the Mississippi River and so forth. But this is a very rare boat. We did an archaeological survey of it. This was a photo mosaic that we did of it, and this was 1983 in Lake Champlain. In 1989, we went with National Geographic up to Lake Champlain on an expedition that they were on, and they weren't successful in finding what they were looking for. And we said, well, let's go over to Burlington and we'll cut a hole in the ice and we'll put your ROV down on the horse-powered ferry boat. And so they did, and then well, that was February. So in October of '89, we had a 9-page spread in National Geographic. So that was really cool. And I think at that point, we were saying, you know what, this is the pinnacle of our career. This is the pinnacle right here. We didn't have a crystal ball to know what was coming, but we just thought this was so cool to have an article to find this very rare boat, and also to have an article on National Geographic. So yeah, it was then sometime after that. Well, we were doing work in the Finger Lakes as well. We've had about 30 canal boats in the Finger Lakes. So this would be in Seneca Lake and Keokuk Lake, and a couple in Keokuk Lake as well. So we were going places where we could dive and or just like that. It was just absolutely amazing, and great fun too. Just yeah, that was. It was not quite the work that we have to go through these days. These days in Lake Ontario, the feeling is if we can find one a year, then we're lucky. So that's the difference. That's the big difference. So.
What brought you back to Lake Ontario after being in the Finger Lakes and in Lake Champlain?
Yeah, well, one of the things that happened is that around 1986, we had found a lot of stuff in Lake Champlain, found a lot of things in the Finger Lakes, knew we couldn't go out in Lake Ontario because it was just, we couldn't dive on anything that if we did find something out there. So, and my kids were at the age that they needed dad to do things with, So I had a fellow out west wanted the side scan, and I wasn't at that point using it very much. So I thought, oh well, okay, I'll sell it because we're not using it to do anything anymore. So I sold it, and then I spent a lot of time with my kids. They were in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts. Involved in skiing activities, and then Little League baseball. So I was a Weeblos leader so I think I made the right call at that time to
Sure.
put the effort into my family. But then as it turns out, we get back into around 10 years later, and the fellow that bought the Sonar, he had been down in the Caribbean for some years and was using the Sonar a little bit, but put it under his bunk. And of course, it's the salt got into everything. And so he came back here and said, Jim, he was actually sailing, and he came through the Erie Canal and right through Fairport where I lived, and so I dropped the Sonar off, and then he was going back out into the Lake Erie and Lake Michigan on a kind of a sailing tour, and so he dropped the Sonar off, and I said, okay, well, I'll condition it for you, and then said, okay, yeah, do that, and go ahead and use it, and I'll come back at some point and pick it up. Well, he never came back. So I had the use of it, from the mid '90s on. I went back to Lake Champlain and did some things back there. And then we get into around 2000 and 2002. And I'm thinking, don't have a partner. I really need to find a partner. And I go into this dive shop, and I was thinking maybe the dive shop owner might be interested in doing some things out in Lake Ontario. And so, well, I'd be interested, but I'm kind of busy right now. I have accounting business as well, but there's a guy that comes in here every so often, he's a technical diver and he fills his tanks, and he's a young guy, and why don't you talk to him? And I'll give you his name. Fate had it, Dan Scoville walked in 5 minutes later.
Very cool.
And we hit it off, and Dan, being a technical diver, said, "Wow, there's some possibilities here that we could do some things in the Finger Lakes and some of these canal boats that we found that I can't dive on, but you could." And then so we did that, and then after that we saw, what, we can probably look for some things out in Lake Ontario, and not too far from where we live, and is in the Pulteneyville area. There was a ship called the Homer Warren, and we decided that let's go look for the Homer Warren. And so 2002, we looked for it. We didn't find it. And early the next year, we went back out and spent a few weeks, and then we got lucky and we did find it. And Dan dove on it. And then our next thing was, let's go find this sailboat called the Sophia, which sank in 1827.
That's an old one.
It's a real old one, and this would be really cool because it was built in Pulteneyville, and which is quite nearby, and they have a museum there. And it's actually off of Pulteneyville is where the St. Peter was found, and the builder just lived a couple houses down from where the house that the Historical Society, Pulteneyville Historical Society, is in. So we started looking for the Sophia, and we've been looking for the Sophia ever since. So
the one that got away.
It never. We must have gone through that area 10 different times in 10 different directions, and it just is not there. I don't know. Maybe it totally wrecked. Maybe it disintegrated. It was probably built of green wood, and I don't know. And if somebody can find it, God bless them. But we look for it so many times. And after that, we decided, you know what? We did find a couple of other things off of Sodas, but then we made the decision, let's go look in the west, the western part of Lake Ontario. But this time we're not going to look for the Ontario, because the Ontario is just too big an area that it's in, and we have to stay interested. And if we don't find one ship a year, it gets to the point where you say, what am I really doing this for? I'm out here, I'm getting bit by you're getting bit by the flies. The sun is beating down on you. Sometimes even the bees come in, and want a piece of you. You're out there and day after day after day, and you're not finding that thing. So we're not going to look for the Ontario, but there are some other ships that we have a little better information on that's in the west, and let's see if we can find them. And so we did. We did find the Samuel Hodge and the Milan, and they were cool ships. The steamer Hodge burned, and the Milan is a early sailboat that sank in the 1850s with 1,000 barrels of salt on board, and a couple other ships out there. And then finally we got to the point, we said, you know what, we've covered about 200 square miles, and let's give it a shot. This year, this is 2008, and let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can't find the Ontario. Now, HMS Ontario, for those that you don't know, was a British warship. It sank in 1780 with a loss of 120 people on board. Now, let me just say about the payroll. Think about it. payroll would go from Fort Haldeman, which is up in the St. Lawrence River. That's where the base of operations were for the British. And they would go down to Fort Niagara. Well, this ship left Fort Niagara to Fort Haldeman. So I don't think the payroll goes back. So I don't think, I think by that time I started to realize that I don't think there's any payroll on this ship. But we started to look for the Ontario. We went out. We got out that year in 2008. It was very early April. We have never been out that early on the lake in April. But it was calm seas. It was sunny, and but it was cold as heck. Oh man, I had 5 layers of clothing on. You get that. There was probably ice on the water 2 weeks before that, so you know what the water temperature was, and you got a breeze coming off the lake. I mean, it was cold. But finally, in about the 3rd week in May, this is what we found, and there it was. And we were really excited because we thought, you know what, we could see there were 2 crow's nests on that boat, and it measured 80 feet long. It had all the right dimensions, all the right details. That, yeah, I think we got the Ontario. But then we had to wait. The Ontario is very, very deep, and we had to wait 2 weeks before we could get it back out there on a very calm day. And Dan called me. It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 o'clock. He says, "We got to go because the lake is calmed down. The winds have calmed down. We can go out, and we got to do it now." So here we are on Sunday night, 2 a.m. in the morning. And we get over the ship, and it's a kind of thing where the ship is so deep, you just drop an anchor close to it, and you hope the weight of the anchor is going to hold your boat. And that's exactly what we did. And then we put the ROV down on the ship, and it was really interesting. Normally, when we would find a ship, it'd be a lot of excitement or high fives and everything like that. That night, just was Dan and myself, and then our team artist, Chip Stevens, the 3 of us. Nobody said a word. And we were happy in a way that we found it. But at the same time, in the back of our mind, we knew that, 120 people perished on this ship. It's the largest disaster that happened on Lake Ontario, loss of life. And we got 90 minutes of video. We went back and forth on that ship probably at least three times, and really got some good video. I think we looked in most of the places. We certainly looked in the cabin a number of times for that safe, which we never saw. We always thought it was a lot of debris that had just fallen down. So I think there's the myth.
Yeah. Is there any so this vessel is from 1780. I mean, this is, other than the Griffin, this is the oldest shipwreck on Great Lakes. Is there any truth that, I mean, was she carrying American Revolutionary War POWs?
Yes, there were 30 American prisoners of war. There were, I think, 70 British military, and there was 10 women, children, and Indians, so civilians, on that ship. Now, the only, the debris, some of the debris did come in. The binnacle came in, some blankets, some hats. They said boats, so I assume boats means at least 2. There were probably some small boats that were being carried on board. and they came in at a place called Golden Hill, which is about 30 miles west of Niagara, or I'm sorry, 30 miles east of Niagara. And one of the hats that they found was Captain Andrews' hats. About in July of 1781, they actually found the remains of 6 British. They didn't know who they were. They were unrecognizable, but they ended up about 12 miles east of Niagara. It was a northeast storm that took the Ontario down.
Jim, is there cannon on the deck? I think there's cannon doors. I mean, is there military?
Yeah, there's several cannon. And for those people that are interested in seeing a little bit of a video of this, you can go on my website, Shipwreck World, and there's a 3-minute video on there. You'll see. I think you'll see some of the cannon. There's a 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there are 5 cannon that are on the deck of the ship.
What an amazing find! I mean, this really is kind of the holy grail of Lake Ontario shipwrecks, and
certainly is. Yeah, it's probably the oldest fully intact British warship that exists in the world. Because if you think about it, the only wooden ships that are going to survive have to be in fresh water, because if they're in salt water, the teredo worm is going to get into the wood, and sooner or later the whole ship the wooden ship falls apart. So I really believe, and I've never heard of any other fully intact British warship that exists in the world like the Ontario. I swear, if you raise the Ontario, I wouldn't be surprised that if you pumped it out, that it would still float.
Wow. So yeah. Jim, so are you going to give us the numbers?
Oh yeah, sure.
Excellent. Get ready. So it's owned by the British military, right?
Pardon me? It's what?
It's owned by the British military. British
what? The thought was that it belongs to the UK, but in a more recent activity, I believe now that Canada might be the owner of it.
Ah.
And the reason for that is because when Canada became a country, I think part of the deal with the UK was that any boats that existed in that area at the time became the property of Canada.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Does make sense.
Oh yeah, truly one of the great finds, and we're really excited, certainly when we found it, but humbled also by the tragedy.
Definitely. So where did you go next in your explorations?
Well, from there we continued on. One of the things that at the end of that season, we were Dan was interested in he loves steamers. So one of the ships that are out there is called the Nisbet Grammar, and there it is. And so we started to look for the Nisbet Grammar. And again, we're looking in very deep water. Now, what did we have for a side scan sonar? We were using Dan's Yellowfin. We had 2,000 foot of cable as well. So we're really looking in very, very deep water, in the area of 500 to 600 feet. So we start looking for the Nisbet Grammar, and well, we don't find it, but we find something else. And it was really rough weather, and all of a sudden we're having problems with the sonar. And it wasn't the sonar, it was the cable. And the cable was breaking. And so we would go in one direction for a while, and all of a sudden, we'd lose the signal. And then all of a sudden we see something on the bottom, and wow, that looks like a wreck, and we turn the boat around, and we go back for it, and we just get past it, and from the other direction, and we see this wreck, and then all of a sudden we lose the signal, and what happens is there were breaks in the cable. So the cable got trashed, and I think part of the reason was there was a little too much weight in the towfish at the time, and there was some problem with the cable, that it was bending around something a little too sharply. So you're not supposed to bend, wrap the cable around something in a tight radius, because it'll break the conductors. And so, but we had a wreck that we saw from one direction and then the other direction. So get back home, I did some calculations, and I said, you know what? I think we can get back on this thing without the sonar, because I got two readings from two different directions. And so I calculated where it could be. And this now really is late in the season, but we had it was probably in October sometime, and we towards the end of October, but we got out there, and we put the ROV down, and the calculations were great. And what we found was a very rare daggerboard schooner. And
wow.
maybe you have a picture of Chip's picture of the daggerboard somewhere, maybe. But
no, I don't think
we didn't know what this was, because there were two. You probably do have it, but whatever. Maybe not. I don't know.
I've got the sloop Washington. That's about it.
Oh, okay. Maybe I didn't send it to you. But we found this. There are boards. These two boards are sticking up, and they're about 4.5 feet each. And the dagger boards are meant to go down through the keel of the boat. And the reason for that, a daggerboard schooner is a very shallow draft boat. And in the early 1800s, you really didn't have deep harbors. So you had to have a boat that could get into shore and offload cargo. But when you got out in the lake, you needed a keel so that the ship isn't going to be, or your schooner is not going to be pushed windward, and easier to control it. So there we were. We find this daggerboard schooner. We didn't know what it was, but later on, and doing some research, we found out that this schooner it's a daggerboard schooner, a very rare ship. And they were only around until about the 1820s, mid 1820s, because then somebody developed the pivoted centerboard, and that was a whole lot easier to control than trying to stick these boards down through the keel. And they were in a watertight box, but still, it must have caused some difficulty, and I'm sure those things got stuck. And but there we were. I read later on that the first daggerboard schooner that was on Lake Ontario was in 1806. So that it gives you a kind of a bracket, sort of between 1806 and in the mid 20s. That very like 20 years when these daggerboards were actually on Lake Ontario. So yeah, we found this very rare ship.
Very cool.
it was a few years later that we found another Daggerboard schooner, and this was in the east. It's called the Three Brothers, and we found that it was going between Pulteneyville and Oswego, got caught in a storm and went down. Now that Daggerboard was 12 feet long. That must have been really difficult to maneuver. But that's really a beautiful ship. And on Shipwreck World on my website, I think there's a small video on there. You can see what it looks like. So we were really happy. We found, two very rare ships. And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy is not just finding a regular old schooner, but finding something a little different, something that sort of adds to our maritime history that we really didn't know much about, and we actually now have video and images to show the public of just what some of these things really look like.
Well, because you're on Lake Ontario, there's these really early vessels that we don't have on the other lakes.
You're
some
right.
of the units you're kicking out there blow the minds of Lake Michigan, maritime historians.
Yeah, it's really a different situation. Out west, you hear more about steamers and ships like that. Well, we don't have as many. In fact, the only two steel steamers that completely full steel steamers that are in Lake Ontario we found, the Nisbet Grammar and the Roberval. So but as you're showing, both of those, there's the that's the here's the Roberval. And now that's kind of an interesting story. That was as we went back to Lake Ontario from our searches in the west. This was one of the first ships that we went after, and Wes Olszewski, maybe he's on tonight, I don't know. He wrote a book, and in the book there was a chapter on, I think, matchsticks on the water, and it's about the Roberval. And Roberval was going from up in the St. Lawrence River with a big load of lumber to the Diamond Match Company in Oswego. And with a big piles of lumber on a ship like that, that tends to act almost like a sail. And so they got on their way to Oswego, and about midway, they ran into a northwest storm, which is where our prevailing winds come from. And, the ship went down, and several people were lost in it. 3 of the crew members actually got in the lifeboat, which was damaged, and rowed to Oswego. And the other 3 members, the cook and the captain and the mate, they grabbed a lot of the lumber and tried to make a makeshift raft and floated around for about 30 hours before they were found. But here it is, after a couple of years of looking for the Roberval. It was the end of the season, but it was a calm day. My partner Roger and I decided, let's go to Oswego. Let's go out and let's just see. We'd been looking for the Roberval and just had put a lot of time in, but had not found it. And we decided, let's do a Hail Mary search. We're going to go further out in the lake than we've ever gone before, and just do some scans. I mean, there was nobody out on the lake. All the boats, no boats in the marina. They were all put away, and the Coast Guard was doing training on shore. So good luck if we ran into the problem out there. We were all alone. Put the side scan in the water, and 90 minutes later, that's the picture we got right up there in the top of the screen. So yeah, we had found it, and we put Roger's ROV down on it, and we got some video of the ship. We went back another time as well and got some video. And very interesting on this particular ship, the robber valve essentially has a kind of a wood frame, and then they put steel sheeting on the outside, so it's not steel through and through.
Sure.
So it was kind of interesting to see that. But yeah, that was that was our Hail Mary search. So that ended a great season, making that discovery.
So Jim, we're coming up on 10 minutes. We've got time probably for one more good story.
We got any
talk-
questions? Anybody out there?
Well, we do have some questions, but can we talk about the Lady Washington before we do the questions?
Sure.
All righty.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great story on the Lady Washington. Here's a ship that was built in 1798 for the Pennsylvania Population Company. Pennsylvania Population Company had a big tract of land down around Erie, Pennsylvania, and they needed they commissioned a ship to be built, the Washington, to transport people and goods from probably up around the Buffalo area and to their big tract of land. So they were, selling the land to settlers. And after about 2 years, they decided that, this ship is not really making any money anymore, so let's go sell it. So they sold it to a group of merchants. One of the key merchants was named Robert Hamilton, who I think Hamilton, the town of Hamilton in Ontario, I believe, was essentially came from his name or his family. But anyway, so they purchased the boat, and how do you get? He lives in Queenston, so how do you get the boat to go from Lake Erie up to Queenston? Well, they brought it up to a place called Chippewa, just below Niagara Falls, and there was a road still there today, not quite in the same shape or form, but it's called Portage Road. And during the winter, they moved that ship on rollers 8 miles up around the falls to Queenston. And this was in November timeframe, so probably some snow on the ground as well. But and for the next 4 years, the Washington ran between Queenston and Kingston and down to Oswego. In Oswego, they would pick up salt because that was a preservative for food. Salt was coming up from Liverpool, which is near Syracuse, up the Oswego River to Oswego. So that was on a monthly basis. That's what they would do. Now, some people call it the Lady Washington, and it really is the Washington. But I think early on, a lot of people liked the name Lady Washington, so the name's kind of stuck. But when you look at the registrations in Kingston, it's registered as when they came into port as Washington. So the right name is really Washington. So here we are in 1803, and it was the last trip of the season. They go up to Kingston from Queenston to pick up goods that were coming down from the St. Lawrence River. Pick the goods up, and we're headed to Oswego. And unfortunately, they got caught in a storm and never made it, and there were no survivors as well. So we were really excited when we saw the side scan image of the ship, because it's a sloop, and there was just we saw on the side scan there was one mast, and we knew that this is probably the right area.
Probably early.
So and then the rest is, you can see the wonderful, picture of the ship there in the upper portion of the screen. We think that it was actually, then when it sank, it actually went down stern first, because of a lot of damage in the stern, and the cabin roof popped off as well. So it's the second oldest shipwreck that exists in the Great Lakes. So we got one in number 2.
Very, very, very cool ship. So Jim, can you tell me a little bit about this?
Shipwrecks of Lake Ontario, A Journey of Discovery. Yeah, the book that I wrote came out this year, or last year, on May 1st. It's published by the National Museum of the Great Lakes. And it really chronicles a little bit about my journey, some of which you heard tonight, but also I try to include not only the discovery of the ships that we found, but also some of my shipwreck peers that have found ships off of the New York shore in Lake Ontario. So they wrote chapters of the book. As far as the Ontario is concerned, there are 3 chapters in there. One about our discovery, number 2 about the weather. My friend Bob Hamilton works for NOAA over in Buffalo. He wrote a book. He wrote a chapter on the weather that sank the Ontario, and it's based on the weather that was going on at the time. And he did a lot of research, and then pulled that weather together and drew some weather maps based on information that we know today when you see what's happening in other areas. So that's kind of interesting to find out what really sank the Ontario, the weather that sank the Ontario. And the third is for model makers out there, the most authentic model of the Ontario was created by my friend Ray Peacock. He lives in Canada. And he wrote a wonderful chapter in there about how he created the model and some of the tools that he used to create various pieces. And so you can get the book on. Yes, you want a wonderful review of the book, so I appreciate that.
Well, so we're coming down to the end of our hour here, and it's been a great talk, Jim. I really appreciate you sharing all those amazing stories. I mean, some of the wrecks that you found are just epic. Some of the early dates, just stuff that we don't even have over here on this end of the lakes. But let's take some questions from our audience. We've already got one queued up here. One of our viewers asks if you could talk about the odd cargo of the Homer Warren.
Odd cargo. The Homer Warren had coal on board.
Just coal? Okay.
Just coal. And, it's kind of interesting. My friend Teddy Garlock, and along with Jill Heinrich, they dove on that last year, or 2 years ago, I think, to get some pictures for the book. In some discussions I had with them, and for when Dan dove on it as well, I think the coal, I think the boat tipped over on its side. Well, a couple of things. One is that we could see a debris field. This was some years ago when we did a side scan. We could see a debris field from when the ship got in trouble, and from where it landed. So a lot of pieces started to come off. And in fact, the whole top structure came off. But it also appears like the ship rolled, and because it looks like the cargo of coal got completely spilled out of it. It must have gone down. It must have been kind of sideways, because the boilers came out, and then everything went to the stern of the ship, and the stern is dug right into the bottom. You can't even see the propeller.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so it kind of, my theory is that it kind of rolled and tipped up, dumped its cargo, and then and then the whole thing smashed right. Went stern down, stern first, and dug itself right into the bottom big time. So that's the Homer Warren.
So any other questions from our audience? We've got a minute here left. Anybody else have a question for Jim Kennard? Give it a second here.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who don't know, many of you have seen my pictures that I post on the website of my side scans. That's a deep vision little eye that I bought from Jim Kennard. Jim is the person who kind of gave me the pointers for how to use it, and those beautiful images I get. Thanks to Jim Kennard for getting me up to speed.
Yeah, you're doing great. I would encourage anybody, if they have any questions, go on my website. You can contact on Shipwreck World. You can contact me that way, and also you can enjoy a little bit more of the stories, that some of which I told, and then also some of the other ones that we didn't have time to talk about. But there are some images and some info on there, and if you want to get more into it, go and get the book.
And for those of you who don't know, my Great Lakes, my Lost Ship of the Month that I post every month, I post that on Shipwreck World. That's where it's hosted. If you want to see all my past Lost Ships of the Month, go to shipwreckworld.com. That's where it's all kept. So let's wrap things up. Jim, once again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And it was a great hour of discussion.
It's good to be here.
And this video is going to be on YouTube. I'm going to upload it tonight. It's going to be on YouTube forever, along with the other guests. So it's a good documentary. It's good documentary evidence for a lot of our Great Lakes maritime history personalities, wreck hunters, and historians. Because it'll be out there in the ether, forever now. So,
oh my God.
I'm sorry, Jim. For those of you who are regular viewers, or even if you're not, I encourage you to bring your friends to come on in and watch live and ask us questions. Tom Crossman is going to be on next week. Do join us for Tom. He's a really interesting guy with some amazing technology and a really kind of a fun guy to talk to. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you again, Jim Kennard, for coming on.
It was good to be here.
And everybody, have a nice evening. Good night.
Good night.